so a lot of you guys have been asking me about hunters in season 6 and their viability, and one big thing that I wanted to draw up is that I think that there's a lot of viability still that can be made from duo lane, and I think a lot of really cool stuff that you can still do with some of the hunters in season 6. And so I kind of just want to break things down for everybody, give you guys a little bit of insight into some of the hunters that I think might be viewed as the top meta picks for season 6, at least for whenever Pro League kicks back up again later on in March. But Kurdinos is the first one that I want to take a look at because he has really started to rise in popularity recently and rank from what I've noticed. I think a large reason for this is definitely because of the recent buffs he received. That Bramble Blast is a big thing to take a look at because there's already been some dabbling with hunters in mid lane and competitive play as far as season 5 is concerned. One large reason for that is because hunters can provide a lot of early game pressure, and since red buff and purple buff were so heavily contested throughout season 5, at least from summer to fall split, I think that we can kind of expect to see the same sort of focus carrying on into season 6, because season 5 and season 6 do carry a lot of similarities between the metas. Not a whole lot was drastically shifted. I don't think that it is a bad thing by any means, that the meta has still remained primarily the same for the most part, but I definitely can expect to see some balance changes, I think, as the year progresses, because I know that the team is always looking to see how they can kind of keep things fresh and proactive for their players and player base. But getting back to Kernanos and the Bremoblast relevancy, it's really good lane pressure. And I think that also having the consistent setup as well that you can get from the root off of Bremoblast is something that is also really important to look at, because you're going to be able to apply a little bit of dot damage, apply that root, so you already get some consistent CC there from Kernanos in just one part of his ability. But he also just hits really freaking hard in his summer stance as well off of the one. I think that Kernanos is a hunter that is only going to continue to rise in popularity, at least if he remains in his current state. Um, I don't view him as broken, because I definitely do think that there's still some counterplay potential since he doesn't have CC immunity off of his ultimate. But the Wild Hunt is an excellent ultimate as far as big objective contention is concerned, and that is yet another reason why in competitive play I would probably expect to see a little bit more Kernanos than what we have experienced in the past, because Kernanos off of the Bramble and the Wild Hunt alone, I think that is more than enough to deem him as a potential top hunter for Season 6. And I mean, I know ranked is never a good thing to base things off of, but since his buff, every single one of the games that I have played recently, I've had a lot of success on this guy. I've had a pretty easy time getting damage out, and I think that's a big thing, is that hunters in competitive play, you want the big damage numbers, because there's going to be a lot of gameplay action surrounding the duo side buffs of red and purple. And so if you're able to get off to a good jump start with Kernanos, whether he's in mid or in that ADC role, I think he can definitely have a really strong impact on the match. So that's going to be the first hunter that we covered. And next up, might catch you guys a little bit off guard as well, but I think Apollo is a pretty big sleeper pick too. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but Apollo has a pretty crazy ultimate where we all know Audacity from Apollo. I mean, this is the boxing galore. Like, this is your bread and butter when it comes to boxing on Apollo. You really want to try and work around your Audacity passive, because if you have that procced, chances are you're not losing that dual lane trade or any 1v1 trade on Apollo unless you're severely behind. But to break him down a little bit further here, his Audacity charges pretty fast in the dual lane. You have really strong lane clear starting right off the bat from level 1. Even in that brief little boxing segment, if you want to play a little bit more aggressive with Apollo, I think he's one of the few hunters that you can afford to be a little bit more aggressive on because of this Audacity passive. Because even if you're just autoing the enemy dual lane, before that timer hits 0 or whatever, it doesn't really matter, because you're still stacking your passive, which is only going to get you that Audacity charge even faster when that level 1 or when that first creep wave comes into play. So you should be out clearing if you go with Apollo in the duo lane. It does get a little bit dangerous though, because for as strong as his early game can be, his mid and late game definitely have punishable aspects. big thing to first point out is the moves. His dash, I think Apollo can kind of suffer a little bit here with his escape potential, because a lot of assassins are so conditioned to just going for the big blink ability burst damage that it can be really tough for Apollo to survive this, even through his Serenade. But it's important to bring up his Serenade here because of the fact that if somebody does try to commit to you, at the very like worst case scenario, you die, but you might be able to pull somebody's actives. You might be able to pull beads, or you might be able to pull like an Aegis because they're expecting some kind of counter gank. So there's a lot of decent counterplay potential, but there's also setup potential for your own team here on Apollo. I would probably anticipate him to be viewed as more of a mid lane type god because of his rotational power from his ultimate. That is relatively strong still, and I do believe that the pros still view this pretty as a pretty useful ultimate because it introduces split push capabilities. It introduces, quick ganking potential, and if the enemy team doesn't have a hunter with a semi-global or a global, how are they really meant to keep up? Chernabog's really one of the few hunters. Chernabog and Jingwei are like some of the few hunters that can keep up with Apollo, and even then, it's not always like guaranteed. Um, so Apollo, primarily because of the fact that the meta is still so early game based, that's one of the main reasons why I view him as a little bit of a sleeper pick, but as somebody that could also be very, very strong in top level ranked and like competitive play as season 6 continues. I really cannot say it enough, but like you should try it out. You might find like you'll get off to a pretty strong start on Apollo. Like, ignore the fact that I suck with him. Like, that doesn't really matter. Like, this doesn't really matter. But like, he is a good god. I definitely think that he's a super pick. I think that there's a lot of potential in Apollo for season 6. Um, Next up on the list, I think it kind of goes without saying. You guys have seen a lot of her whenever the lands come into effect, but Jingwei. Jingwei, I think, will probably always be considered a top hunter for competitive play in her current state, simply because of the fact that she is just so damn safe. You cannot go wrong with picking Jingwei in almost any situation. It's just, you have so much safety guaranteed off the ult alone that she really forces the enemy team to try and find a different way to punish her, and that typically ends up being inside of the jungle buff invades. What Jingwei lacks in buff control, she can definitely confirm throughout team fights. I think that persistent gust knockups. I mean, knockup is always going to be considered the best CC in Smite because once you're up in the air, that's it. Like, you can't get away from that position. That if you beat, it's too late. You're just screwed. But Jingwei's got a great passive. The fact that you can get back into the action really fast, depending on where your team takes those fights. And even if they are taking those fights at red buff, Jingwei's passive, being one of the few gods that you can back to from lane and join the team fight later on, I think is a really undervalued skill here by a lot of casual and ranked players. I do think that she'll probably rise a little bit more in popularity as well whenever the competitive season comes back, because I also am expecting competitive players or pros to still want to mess around with Jingwei a lot, mostly because of the fact that jungle and mid are so influential towards the red and purple buffs on dual lane side that if your team is in a losing position, or if you're against like a losing pressure enemy composition, then the good news is that Jingwei will always keep you safe and sound for the most part. Like, it's very difficult to die on this god. So I know a lot of pros like her just from the safety measures alone, because so many ADCs have just been so used to being ganked at like levels 3 through 5 from the jungle mid of the enemy team, that they just want as much survivability as possible, because Jingwei's late game potential is insane. If you can just farm it out and deal with a little bit of XP loss early on, but delay the game into that mid late game stride, that's where you're really going to start to see Jingwei take off and flourish, because whether you're going for a crit oriented build or forced into attack speed penetration, I think that Jingwei still has a lot of team fighting capabilities because of that persistent gust and from the AoE spread off of explosive bolts.
Jukes that way.
Those are two really big things for team fighting abilities, and I just can't stress it enough that if you want to survive in season 6 from the mid jungle ganks, Jingwei's probably your best bet. Next up on the list, I think you guys are all too familiar with this guy as well, but I still think that Chernabog has a lot to bring to the table. He's kind of simmered down recently in terms of people viewing him as like a super strong god, but personally, I still feel like there's a lot of outplay potential involved with Chernabog, and his rotational speed is just unlike anything else. I think a large thing too is that I've seen more. I've noticed more players have started to do it, but I genuinely believe that you are better off starting with your level 2 as opposed to starting with the level 1 in terms of lane clear. With the 2, you get that attack speed story, but all those autos, because of the fact that Chernabog's passive works with 3 stacks of Heart Cold explodes for extra AoE damage, that gives you better lane clear as opposed to starting with your one, especially depending on what kind of support you're pairing Chernabog with. I think he definitely fares a little bit better with supports that are able to clear the lane like decently well, but Chernabog can also hold his own in losing matchups. I think that he's a god that if you are starting with a Vicious Barrage at level 1, you're probably going to be able to clear the lane fast enough that the enemy dual lane won't be able to invade your purple buff. So that's one of the reasons why I definitely view Chernabog as a god that I would personally like to see a little bit more so in Season 6. I think that he is still incredibly strong. He's got a really high skill ceiling, though. I think that as far as playing Chernabog is concerned, he's a really easy god to play. But as far as like making his kit seem super fluid, you need to be a little bit more of an experienced player to be as effective on him. But if you think that you're at that level, I would definitely recommend this god. He's got crazy outplay potential because of that ultimate. You can never really go wrong with an ult that gives you damage mitigation, movement speed, and a slow against the enemy team. Even if you're not rotating to the team fights, it can kind of work like a global CC just by pressing 4 from the duo lane. Even if you don't choose to like fly into the team fight, you might be able to save your teammate's life. And I think a lot of people really undervalue how slow the shadow slow can actually be, and like how limiting it can actually be to the enemy team as far as trying to help your team escape and the like that. So something to keep in mind, just a little bit of food for thought. Chernabog's ult isn't always necessarily for going in. It can also be for getting people out as well. Um, but yeah, I really like the boxing that he has. I think that he's a really strong boxing god. Although probably his biggest limiting factor for newer and more inexperienced players is the fact that his auto switch stance on the hands, that can be really weird to get used to. It took me a very long time to get used to it, at least. I don't know if I'm maybe like speaking to myself here, but I definitely think that once you get the hang of those Chernabog autos, he's probably one of the better hunters out there. And next up, can't ever count this guy out. Just for the simple reason that I think so many people prioritize the early game pressure right now, but a few of the hunters kind of fall into the same category for me because we've talked about Kernanos, we've talked about Apollo, we talked about Jingwei, we talked about Chernabog, but as far as that fifth slotted hunter is concerned, this is where team compositions I think matter a little bit more so than the hunter itself, and that's why season 6 I don't think that you should really view the duo lane as what hunter should I play, more so you should view it as what hunter would best benefit the rest of my team's composition. And that's why I think that some of the more successful hunter players in Pro League tend to be a little bit more flexible. Cyclone Spin is an excellent example because I know he only, you guys are going to be like, oh, he only played Xbalanque for the entire year or something like that. But truth be told, I think Cyclone could have filled just about any hunter when his team needed him to on Splice. And I think that it's also relevant bringing up Xbalanque here because he's the next one I wanted to highlight as far as being a strong choice still in season 6. And number one reason for that, it's just his ult. His ult is just that good. Darkest Nights, the fact that you're able to completely cut off an entire team's communications for X amount of time, like for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a really long time in a competitive level of play, especially when you factor in that these fights aren't necessarily going to be in lanes where everything is kind of clear cut to see. Sometimes it'll take place in the jungle. Sometimes it'll take place around the Pyromancer, Fire Giant, Gold Fury. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, this ult from Xbalanque is probably the most powerful ult in the game, and so it's the main reason why I have him listed as one of the top 5 hunters, I think, for season 6, because it's just going to be
Still here.
incredibly
Thanks for your
strong.
content. Keep being the best, GG.
And that is why I think that Shibalanke is just a fantastic choice for anybody who is trying to figure out, and he's relatively safe as well. He's got pretty decent clear, although you do have to be smart about your positioning in team fights. You need to be really smart about your positioning in team fights with Shibalanke, because if you get a little bit too close to the action, you might get fragged by the enemy team. His 3, before you get into that CC immunity phase of the Rising Jaguar, it can be interrupted. So if you're not careful with your positioning, Shibalanke can be relatively easy to pick off when focused, but he does deal a ton of damage. Has got a very reasonable passive, I think, that can certainly deal a lot of damage. And the poison darts, of course, a lot of people don't realize it does slow. Poison darts are fantastic for this slow, and you should always be looking to try and apply this slow in team fights onto as many people as possible. Whether you're looking to auto with them shortly afterwards or not, it's just slow is a great feature to have off of this. But going back to what I mentioned earlier, where I feel like hunters are more so needing to be picked in terms of team compositions as opposed to direct like 1v1 matchups or 2v2 matchups. The reason why I left that up in the air is because personally, I feel like Uller, Chiron, Hui, Izanami, Anher, Medusa, Neith, like Ram, all of these gods, all of these hunters, I think can fill and meet a special niche of season 6 meta. But it all just really depends on what you're looking for in these team compositions. And that's why, as far as like season 6 is concerned, I definitely think that Carninos, Apollo, Jingwei, Shibalanke, and Chernabog would have to be my top 5 picks. But that's not to say that, all of these hunters are useless. I think my least favorite hunters for season 6 would probably be Cupid and AMC still. But not because I think they're like worthless or anything like that. AMC is just so punishable right now without having an escape, a guaranteed escape, and with the way that mid jungle works currently in terms of experience, I think it's hard to just put AMC into the dual lane because junglers are going to be ganking you by level 5 when you're still level 3, and that's one of the primary reasons why AMC has fallen off so hard in the dual lane, and why you tend to see him only ever messed around with in mid lane because he's just so much safer in mid where he's able to gain a little bit of XP. Cupid, kind of in the same boat. I think that Sprint just frags Cupid a little bit too hard for my liking, for my taste. I think one Heavenly is really all it takes to shut down the Cupid ultimate. And if you can sprint down to the Cupid ult, I mean, he's even easier to kill after the fact. I definitely do not think that Cupid is a god people should be prioritizing right now for ranked or competitive play, but of course, in competitive play, in heavy CC compositions, like in super high CC compositions, I wouldn't mind seeing a Cupid. Because then you're probably going to want that Cupid ultimate just to force out the initial Heavenly or like the initial round of beads. That way your team can further collapse. So, like I mentioned, definitely lots of viability with just about any of these hunters. And I hope that helps you guys out with figuring out, or I hope that this is able to help everybody out with trying to decide on what hunters they want to experiment with in season 6. I also wanted to add in this last little note because I have been getting asked as well a lot about Runeforged on certain hunters. I went around in jungle practice for a little bit myself to test things out. I think that Runeforge Rush is definitely viable on hunters that can apply their own form of CC stack. So what that means is you're mostly going to be looking at hunters that have some form of a slow or have some form of like anything that's just able to really slow and like intervene and like any sort of CC. That's all you want, because when you look at Runeforge, well, let me pull it up. You can see here, like it got worked around a little bit. Oh, I didn't want to pull it up like there. Okay, I guess I just have to. All right, but anyways, Runeforge was changed a little bit for Season 6 recently. 55 physical power, 200 health. Already two really big things for hunters that they're going to like. I mean, 55 physical power right off the bat from rushing this item. That's a pretty big power spike. 200 health as well. That guarantees a little bit of survivability off of jungle mid ganks for hunters. But The important part is that passive, where enemies take 15% increased damage from you if they are affected by crowd control, does not include knockbacks, blinds, or grabs. So knockbacks, they're looking at like Honor Impale, will not apply Runeforged Hammer. Blinds, Shibalanke Ultimate, that's not going to apply Runeforged Hammer. And the Scotty Patch Ice Patch count for CC, yes, because they are skidding around. That's like it's going to count that. Because I don't believe that permafrost is a knockback. I'm pretty sure that permafrost isn't factored in as knockback. Um, that one's a little bit questionable. So I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty confident that you're good to go with Scotty on this. If anything, I mean you still have Calder to apply the slow. Your one can still apply the slow. It's there's a very easy ways to apply it, but you just want hunters that have two or more forms of CC in their kits, and it can include their ultimate. So the hunters that I think that Runeforge would best be applied to, you're probably going to be looking at AMC, Artemis, Carnanos. Um, I don't really like it for Chiron or Cupid personally. I do think that you can attempt it, but I would not recommend it. Hu Yi, I think Hu Yi you can get away with this for sure because you've got your Mark of the Crow Ricochet as the first thing, and you can get a couple of autos in, and those deal some decent damage. Not only that, but his slow the whole time. If anybody is underneath Hu Yi's ultimate in the slow, Runeforge is applying that 15% extra, so that's pretty crazy. Which is why I think Hu Yi deserves to make the list. I think that Neath is definitely good for Scotty, like we already mentioned, and Uller. Everybody else, I'm a little bit skeptical on. I do think that while it's possible to make Runeforge work on just about every single other hunter that I didn't list, I do think that you're complicating things a little bit more so for yourself than what you would if you were to just go a more traditional route, like with Transcendence or Devos or an Executioner, because for 2300 gold, I mean, you can get Devos. For 2350 gold, you get Executioner. So it all depends on what kind of risk versus reward situation you're looking at. But for the hunters that I did list Runeforge for, and for those hunters, I want to elaborate a little bit further because I don't want you guys thinking that Runeforge is like the automatic only way to possibly build hunters right now because that's not the case at all. You still have plenty of viability if you choose to go for a Devos or a Transcendence Rush or even a Boots Rush. It doesn't really matter. I definitely think that Runeforge is heavily risk versus reward situation. I expect it to be an item that is more common amongst the higher levels of ranked gameplay and competitive play simply because of the fact that there's usually more communication, more synergy involved with players that are more experienced and especially those at the pro level because I mean there are teams that are fully in comms that like that's what they do for a living so you would expect them to get their CC lined up just right for that Runeforge perk. So um, Runeforge, is it good for hunters? I think so. Is it worth building every single game? Not necessarily, but feel free to try it on a hunter that has two or more self CC applying options in their kit. And other than that, I think that Runeforge is just an item that is going to be a lot of fun to play around with, and just wait and see what happens with it in the future. Because as far as it's staying in its current state, personally, I feel like it might be a little bit too powerful for that for the price. So I wouldn't be surprised if this item ended up getting a slight nerf or a shift of some sort in the future. But for right now, I definitely would not recommend against building it. If you feel like you are a more experienced hunter, I think that Runeforge is definitely a viable build path that you can experiment around. Um, Other than that, though, that is going to conclude my review on Hunters in Season 6, as well as Runeforge, when to buy it, and who to buy it for. So, hope that this video is able to help you guys out just a little bit more with explaining that, and have a good one.